Steven Pinker is an experimental psychologist who has written extensively on language, cognition, and how our mind works. I'm sure many of you would be familiar with his works. Some of his popular books include The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Sense of Style, The Blank Slate, Enlightenment Now. And all these books are pretty amazing in their own way, and I would recommend you to read them if you find time. And I will tell you briefly about what these books are all about. So, for example, this book called The Sense of Style is one of the less popular ones, but I find quite interesting. This is one book that I keep going back to, and it helps a lot in terms of finding your style of writing, and if you want to improve your writing, this is a really, really interesting book. So the book is all about how you can write better, and it derives its knowledge from the world of linguistics, cognition, and human psychology in general. And it gives you very interesting insight on how you can connect with your readers as a writer, and consequently how you can become a better writer. Similarly, the two other books called The Language Instinct and How the Mind Works, they're also about our cognitive abilities, and particularly the one about the language instinct. It deals with linguistics and tells us about how language works, as in how we learn, and what is the science and neuroscience behind it. Some of the more popular books of his are The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now. Both these books will give you an idea of how, as human beings, we've made a lot of progress, and there is a lot of positives to be seen around. But we often ignore those things. We ignore all the facts, and we come to these conclusions that the world is getting worse. There is a lot of intolerance around. There is a lot of growing violence around. Terrible things are happening as news media keep reporting us. But he breaks these myths and presents all kind of statistics and facts to tell us the story of the progress that we have made as human species. And finally, the book that I'm going to discuss today is called The Blank Slate. And this book is centered around the very popular and very old debate, and that is of nature versus nurture. That is to say, how much do we inherit our abilities, our talents, all the things that we acquire? How much are they part of our nature, our physical configuration, our neuroscience, our genes, and how much of it is acquired through learning and education? And I'll give you the spoiler right away. He goes against the idea of blank slate. This was the notion very popular in the 20th century, that we are blank slates. We come into the world as blank slates, and whatever you write on this blank slate, that is, whatever you teach to children, they will acquire those qualities. So if you teach your kid language skills, they're going to acquire language skills. If you're going to teach them violence, they're going to learn violence. Now, Steven Pinker in his book criticizes this myth and asks some very fundamental questions and gives us a lot of evidence in his argument's favor. So, for example, When somebody says that when you teach children something, let's say you teach them a language, surely they are learning through what you are teaching. But there is definitely an inherent mechanism that is ready to acquire that language. If that is not there, you wouldn't learn. In fact, he says that if you or any of us, we came into this world as blank slates, we wouldn't even know where to begin. The blank slates can't do anything. The mind, in that case, wouldn't be able to focus on anything. Because if you look around, despite the education, despite cultures, despite all kinds of different educations and trainings, you'll find certain common human qualities such as empathy. That is very common to humans. It's not something that you're teaching. Similarly, the ability to acquire language is found in all the cultures. So what he's telling us here is that we all have certain predispositions. For sure, you can build upon them, or you can inhibit certain traits of an individual, but it's not that you're starting from a blank slate, from 0 point. There are certain inbuilt mechanisms, talents that are inside us, and those things, they get reflected in our behavior. So he challenges this view of we as some kind of individuals sitting inside bodies and acquiring and learning things. And due to his approach, he gets criticism from both religious right and political left, because religious people criticize him for explaining human mind in purely scientific terms and without having to go for the idea of a soul. And politically left people, they criticize his ideas because there are a number of fears they express. For example, one of them is that if we go by this approach, that people are what they are, you don't really change them much, then it might lead to racism, it might lead to more discrimination, inequality. But Pinker deals with all these criticisms and these objections one by one and explains how we can deal with these arguments without having to change our views about the facts that we are seeing. So what he proposes is, if we are observing certain facts, for example, there are two individuals and they have different skill sets in terms of how their brains function. So let's say one person with a higher IQ can perform certain functions better than the other person who's having the lower IQ. Now, Pinker proposes that is just a fact, but the political consideration of that fact does not have to be the same. So if a person is having a higher IQ, he doesn't need to be treated in a special way. We don't need to make laws accordingly. So just like we can have different heights, different physical features, we can also have different neurological structure, and that affects us, or that can affect the subsequent generations through our genes. And he gives a very interesting example, in fact many examples of how you can determine a lot of things about an individual based on their genetics. So for example, he cites this example of two identical twins, and they were separated at birth. One was raised in Nazi Germany in a Catholic family, and the other was raised in Trinidad in a Jewish family. Now, they never met, these two people, but when in their 40s they were brought together for the first time in their lives since they got separated, there was something very interesting about them, about their habits, how they were wearing very similar kind of clothes at that time, how they had this very peculiar habit of dipping their bread in the coffee or playing certain kind of pranks, which were very similar, but they never learned it from anybody else. So while we may say and we may pretend that humans are blank slates and we can make them whatever they want, whatever we want them to, or whatever they want, the challenge in most cases is we are ourselves restricted by certain biological mechanisms and about which even we are not aware. So, for example, I may want to become a doctor, but that desire itself is coming from somewhere, and that predisposition is usually the problem. But as I said, there are valid objections and challenges, because when we start going along this path, people may start segregating along the lines of race or gender or caste. But as I said, he deals with these questions and provides adequate examples and answers of how this is not really the case. So, for example, in Hitler's case, when he was talking about racism and how Germans were a superior race, he provides enough evidence to suggest that wasn't really the case. So the point here is we shouldn't shut our eyes in the fear of that it may lead to some kind of discrimination. First of all, we must recognize the facts as they are, and then very carefully we need to tread along the political lines about the political consequences of certain discoveries. As I said, if two people don't have same IQ, it doesn't mean in any way, just like if two people are not of physical strength, doesn't mean in any way that they should be treated unequally, or the legal process or the political process should favor one over the other. There are some other objections that arise because of this theory, and one could be about the fear of determinism, that people might think that with this approach we may lose control of our free will, and if we think about our lives in this fashion, we are just like the robots, and that way there will be no meaning in life. So Pinker answers this question by telling us that there is enough space in terms of free will, even if we grant that the universe is predetermined, and even if we assume that we can predict an effect based on its cause, even then there is enough space for us to feel that we have this free will and act accordingly. But I think in the minds of skeptics, this fear of nihilism or living in a world without God, or living in a world where everything can be explained in terms of psychology and neuroscience, and that the fact that they don't possess a soul, that creates a lot of fears. But I think the only way to deal with those fears is to not close your eyes to the facts, but to look them and then find a way, probably then find a better spiritual way which can deal with these challenges. Because the spirituality, just like any other part of our life, any other discipline of our life, it's not a static process. It has to evolve, and it has to evolve throughout human history. So even in this case, if we find there are challenges coming from scientific discoveries, we need to accept them and find ways to live with them.